I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily Week in Review. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says Canada will not tolerate anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, or hate of any kind. Mr. Trudeau sent out a tweet after Montreal police fired chemical irritants into the air as a pro-Israeli demonstration turned violent yesterday. On Saturday, thousands attended a pro-Palestinian march in Montreal to demand an end to Israeli airstrikes on the Gaza Strip. Toronto police have charged 2 men after a pro-Palestinian demonstration, which drew more than 5,000 people to Nathan Phillips Square on Saturday night. Ontario Premier Doug Ford called on the police to investigate any acts of anti-Semitism. Provinces continue to take steps toward hitting their COVID-19 vaccination targets. Ontario administered the 7 millionth vaccine dose for the province over the weekend, as several hotspots tried to scale up their efforts to reach more residents. Vaccine deliveries to Canada will be plenty this week. The federal government is expecting 3.4 million doses from Pfizer-BioNTech and another 1.1 million from Moderna. Well, meanwhile, the government has not named a replacement for Major General Danny Fortin as the head of Canada's vaccine rollout program. But an expert in military affairs says Mr. Fortin's sudden departure, pending an unspecified military investigation, won't likely slow down the operation. Queen's University professor Christian Luprecht says that's because the military always has a second-in-command ready to get the job done. Some health experts say the Ontario government's nursing home policies make little sense and that it's cruel to keep family members apart given high COVID-19 vaccination rates in the homes. The government's own statistics show that 96% of long-term care residents are now fully vaccinated. But visits from family members who aren't official caregivers are still banned due to the province's stay-at-home order. Advocates say Canadians with certain disabilities or underlying conditions have not been a priority during the COVID-19 vaccine rollout, despite being at greater risk of serious or fatal complications from the virus. The executive director of Cerebral Palsy Association of Manitoba says the rollout seems to have been based solely on age, noting residents with underlying conditions, including asthma, cerebral palsy, Down syndrome, and heart conditions, were only prioritized for the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine in late March. New research suggests Indigenous people face a 30% higher death rate after surgery compared to non-Indigenous patients. The Canadian Medical Association Journal published a systemic review indicating Indigenous patients suffer higher rates of surgical complications, including post-operative infections. And Indigenous patients were less likely to undergo surgeries aimed at improving quality of life, such as joint replacements, cardiac surgery, and transplants. Canadian farmers are getting the chance to earn more money as the global economy recovers from the COVID-19 pandemic. Supply shortages from droughts in some areas of the world are contributing to the higher prices, and Mother Nature will determine whether farmers in Western Canada will reap a windfall. Andre Harp, a third-generation farmer in Alberta's Peace region, says huge parts of Western Canada are dry now. He says they will need to get an average crop to benefit from the higher prices. The Canadian surgeon leading an international study on strokes says a simple surgery could prevent fatalities. Dr. Richard Whitlock, a cardiac surgeon for Hamilton Health Sciences, says the procedure is done through the removal of an unnecessary piece of tissue in the heart. He says that the left atrial appendage is where blood clots can form and cause a stroke in patients who have atrial fibrillation, which involves an irregular heart rhythm. The study of 4,800 people in 27 countries is published in the New England Journal of Medicine. 3 more Canadian rowing crews locked up spots for the Summer Olympics. The men's lightweight double, men's single, and men's 4 punched their tickets for Tokyo with their performances at the final Olympic qualification regatta. The results bring Rowing Canada's total delegation up to 10 qualified boats, the largest since the 1996 Games in Atlanta. High Performance Director Ian Bramble said that the final Olympic qualification regatta is a difficult event at the best of times, and our crews came through with flying colors. Canadian researchers suggest boys that are born extremely prematurely tend to age more quickly than those with average birth weights. A team from Hamilton, Ontario's McMaster University tracked a group of men born prematurely at less than 2.2 pounds, while also tracking their normal weight counterparts. Researchers found that the preemies aged more quickly and were biologically 4.6 years older than boys with normal birth weight. The difference was not found between birth weight groups in girls, and the study is published in today's journal Pediatrics. All right, stay with us. Avi Ben Lolo, human rights advocate and expert in Israel, human rights, and countering anti-Semitism, joined us on Forum Daily this week to give us an update on the ongoing violence between Israel and Hamas. We'll be right back after the break with this interview and more national and international news from this past week on the Forum Daily Week in Review. More to come when we return. Stay tuned. Palestinians across Israel are on strike in a rare collective action against Israel's policies. The strike was called by leaders of the Palestinian community inside Israel, which makes up 20% of the country's population. More than 3,200 rockets have been fired at Israeli cities in the last week. Police also reported today that a rocket launched from Gaza has killed 2 Thai workers in southern Israel. Residents in southern Israel say the past week of fighting between Israel and Gaza's Hamas rulers has been far more intense than in previous rounds of violence. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau responded to a protest in Toronto that turned violent over the weekend, where 2 men were charged. Mr. Trudeau tweeted about the, quote, despicable rhetoric and violence that he saw on display, adding that anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, or hate of any kind cannot and will not be tolerated. Well, joining us now to give us an update on the situation is Mr. Avi Ben Lolo, human rights advocate and expert in countering anti-Semitism. Sir, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Thank you for having me, Nina.
So let's start with an update on what's happening right now between Israel and Hamas.
Well, look, the rocket fire is continuing into Israel from Hamas. This morning, we got the tragic news that 2 workers from Thailand, in fact, were killed by this by these rockets. And so, what it shows you, of course, is that these rockets are indiscriminate. They attack everybody, no matter who you are, Jewish, Muslim. We know that many Muslim citizens have already been killed by these rockets. Israel is defending its citizens on a day-to-day basis through its Iron Dome. And frankly, if it wasn't for the Iron Dome, the tragedy would be far worse. And so this is a war crime to fire rockets at Israelis. Israel is still conducting operations to try to neutralize Hamas. Hamas is a terrorist group. It's designated as a terrorist group by Canada, by the international community. It arms itself through militia and builds these weapons and also funnels them from Iran. And, it's got a very serious military force. And so it's important when you're talking about a terrorist organization, really to try to neutralize it so that there's quiet on the border communities that are being affected. And now, as we know, these rockets are also impacting central Israel, Tel Aviv, and even the north.
And I really want to touch on what's happening here in Canada. So going back to this protest in Toronto, people do have a right to protest. I know there's some limitations due to the pandemic, but this particular protest turned violent, according to authorities. And you spoke to the Toronto police chief on this. So can you tell us a little bit more on what happened here?
I think that Saturday was a day really to remember for this city, for Toronto, and for Canada. The violence that we have seen with the videos circulating are just unprecedented. In fact, I often say not since the Christie Pitts riot in the 30s that was against Nazism. Were there riots like that in our city, in the little brawls and skirmishes of Palestinians literally beating up Jewish protesters with sticks and what looked like bats and others, throwing bottles at them and rocks, is really uncalled for and completely inappropriate. And so I know the police has been on it. I've spoken to the chief of police, James Raymer, who's been great and very responsive. And his investigators are looking at the video footage and identifying those people. And as well as I've talked to the York Region Police, because in York Region, there's a very large Jewish community. And of course, the safety and security of the community is integral. We've seen convoys of cars of Palestinians. We've seen demonstrations in various Jewish neighborhoods, reports of groups rampaging through neighborhoods and threatening people. And this is really something that, as a Canadian citizen, as someone who of course, appreciates human rights and decency, this is completely inappropriate behavior. And of course, freedom to protest is welcome, but not violence and disturbing the peace.
So, Mr. Manlola, we've got about 30 seconds left, but I guess the big question is what needs to happen to ensure that the violence in Israel does not encourage violence back here in Canada?
Look, I think we all have to remember that we live here in Canada, that, we're Canadian citizens. It's terrible what is affecting many people around the world, and the violence that is in Israel. Firstly, we need to get and to inspire that the rockets will stop from Gaza, and that they negotiate some kind of peace agreement.
The technology and renewable energy sectors pushed Canada's main stock index to a new high as the loonie hovered around 83 cents US, which is its highest level in 6 years. The Canadian dollar is the best performing currency in 2021. Experts credit the loonie's success to an increase in prices for crops, energy, and metals. Export receipts are also at a record high and are expected to increase, while the cost of lumber is also on a rise, with shipments nearly doubling in the first quarter. However, some economists warn that this may contribute to more stress for key sectors that may be left out of the commodities division. So what does a stronger Canadian dollar mean for Canada's economy overall? Well, joining us now is Brendan Caldwell, Director of Caldwell Securities Limited. Welcome back to Forum Daily, Brendan.
Thank you, Nima.
So what is contributing to the successful growth of the Canadian dollar?
Well, as you mentioned in your intro, it's this commodity, that commodity, the other commodity, but really there's only one commodity, and that's oil. Canada is the only normal country in the world whose currency is really a petrocurrency. After us, perhaps comes Norway and then Mexico, and then the rabbit hole goes very deep after that. Energy prices, which were very weak during the depths of the pandemic, have come roaring back, both due to supply constraints and increasing demand as the world opens up again, particularly in the United States. And we are, as I say, the only real country in the world that has a currency that trades, and that currency is so dependent on the price of oil. So we got a price of energy going up, the loonie is taking wing.
So I guess the big question is this good news for Canada's economy overall?
Well, if you were traveling, it would be great. I mean, the pound and the US dollar and the euro were much less expensive so your trip to France or Florida would be cheaper. Except, of course, no one's going to France or Florida. I think it's even illegal to go to Bob Cajun. So it's not as helpful to the retail person, the individual who would normally take advantage of that. It is somewhat helpful to exporters, of course, because the strong commodity prices have been helpful. But again, if you're exporting in US dollars and your costs are in Canadian dollars, if your labor costs, then that isn't very helpful. If it's offset by higher commodity prices, great. But I think, as you alluded to in your introduction, if what you make is not commodities, but finished products or services, your costs are in US dollars, you're exporting, so your costs are in Canadian dollars, you're exporting in US dollars or some other currency, it's not as helpful.
So what kind of sectors do you think are going to be affected negatively by this increase in the dollar's value?
Well, you would think intuitively that a strong Canadian dollar means a strong Canada. And yes, it is helpful, but really, again, if your costs are in Canadian dollars and that Canadian dollar is strong, it means your costs have gone up from low 70s to now low 80s, 83 cents, I think is where it is at present. So you're seeing everything from the film industry potentially impacted, to technology, to even the commodity sectors, because I mentioned earlier, but at least they have an offset. But when the Canadian dollar got up to more than par, more than 100 cents on the US dollar, you saw in Toronto, we felt this particularly, the film sector almost entirely shut down because it just became too expensive to make movies in Canada. But ultimately, we like seeing the Royal York Hotel in the back of a movie shot and pretending we're somewhere in Sweden or wherever the movie is supposed to be shot, Manhattan, and it's just not. So I think a lot of sectors have the potential to be affected by this.
So what kind of economic disparities would this present for policymakers that are trying to bring Canada out of this pandemic without leaving anyone behind?
Well, I think this pandemic has left a lot of people behind. The disparity between rich and poor, how they've got treatment, how they've been exposed to the virus. One person commented online that we've learned, if nothing else, how to keep rich people safe during a pandemic. So it's a problem. Like, it's a bigger picture problem more than just the dollar. And even now, you're not seeing people that are affluent coming down with cases of COVID, certainly not fatal cases of COVID. Sorry, I'm on a hobby horse. Talking about the dollar, I think that it'll be difficult to get people back to work, to hire people. It'll push more employers toward technological solutions, which require fewer people to work on them. George Jetson, in the old 60s sitcom, his one job was to push a red button to make the factory start. That's not quite where we're at, but it's where we're going to, and a high Canadian dollar accelerates that. So it's going to be difficult for people to find jobs coming out of the pandemic as employers look to technological solutions.
Israel has responded to attacks with another wave of airstrikes across the Gaza Strip. It pushed ahead today despite U.S. calls to wind down the offensive against Gaza's militant Hamas rulers, who have fired thousands of rockets at Israel over the past 10 days. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is facing mounting pressure from his country's closest ally. Diplomatic efforts to negotiate a ceasefire continue, and a senior Hamas official expects a truce soon. Texas Governor Greg Abbott has signed a law that bans abortions before many women even know that they're pregnant. The law puts Texas in line with more than a dozen other states that ban abortions after the detection of a fetal heartbeat, which is as early as 6 weeks. The law includes a unique provision that leaves enforcement to private citizens through lawsuits against doctors or anyone who helps a woman get an abortion. Critics say that will let abortion opponents flood the courts with lawsuits to harass doctors, patients, and nurses. The U.S. House of Representatives has voted to create an independent commission on the deadly January 6th insurrection at the U.S. Capitol. Last night's vote was backed by all Democrats and 35 Republicans in defiance of ex-U.S. President Donald Trump.
So there has been, and there will continue to be no shortage of robust investigations by two separate branches of the federal government. So, Mr. President, it's not at all clear what new facts or additional investigation yet another commission could actually lay on top of existing efforts by law enforcement and Congress.
Republican leaders have been working to stop any bipartisan investigation into the deadly riot. Well, meanwhile, the largest fuel pipeline in the U.S. is confirming what most already thought. It paid ransom to hackers who wrecked its computer system. Colonial Pipeline says it shelled out $4.4 million to the hackers group. Pipeline officials say after they learned of the May 7th invasion, it went offline to try and regain control. But once it saw the potential of continued problems, it decided to pay up. The company says while the decision was not made lightly, it had to be made. The Associated Press has found that videos of ethnic Uyghurs filming themselves denying human rights abuses are part of a Chinese government campaign that raises questions about the willingness of the participants. A text obtained by AP is the first concrete confirmation that the videos are anything but grassroots. Sent to government offices, the text told each office to find one Uyghur to film a video in response to U.S. remarks. While it's not impossible, officials were able to find Uyghurs who were willing. China's documented abuses in the region have led many experts to conclude that it's unlikely. Meanwhile, China has issued its second protest in as many days over the United States naval activity in the region, drawing an unusually sharp response from the U.S. 7th Fleet. It accused Beijing of attempting to assert illegitimate maritime rights at the expense of its neighbors and denied claims by the Chinese military that it expelled the USS Curtis Wilbur when it sailed close to the Paracel Island group in the South China Sea on Thursday. China accused the U.S. of acting unprofessional and irresponsible. Britain plans to bring the national rail network back under government control, reversing one of the most controversial elements of the privatization drive carried out by the conservative governments of the 1980s and 90s. Under plans announced on Thursday, the government will create a new entity known as Great British Railways that will own all railroad infrastructure, set most fares and schedules, collect ticket revenue, and run a single ticketing website. Private companies will continue to operate trains under contracts with the state. The price of the famously volatile digital currency Bitcoin fell nearly 30% at one point yesterday. It came after the China Banking Association warned member banks of the risks associated with digital currencies. The decline narrowed to below 10% in the afternoon, but Bitcoin had still lost about $70 billion in market value in 24 hours. The group representing Quebec's dairy industry has a goal to promote the identity of Poutine. Cheese producer Luc Boivin believes the traditional dish of fries, cheese curds, and gravy is set to become the next big food trend, like hamburgers, tacos, and sushi. Mr. Boivin believes there's a huge opportunity in exporting the cheese curds, which are made primarily in Quebec. Poutine Nation author Sylvain Charlebois suggests rather than trademarking poutine, that Canada follow the lead of France, which is proposing to have the baguette recognized as an intangible cultural heritage symbol. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news from this past week. Remember, for more news on demand, you could always visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, and be sure to follow us on our social media handles on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter for updates. You could also watch all of our commentary programming on the News Forum YouTube channel. Have a great weekend, everyone. We'll see you next time.